This story begins with a fighting game in which a pompous noble named Weiss taunts his opponent, Alan, only to be defeated and used as a shield by the Demon King. Our protagonist, who had been playing this game, suddenly died right after it ended and was reincarnated as the defeated villain, Weiss. Initially, Weiss was punishing a palace maid, Lilith, with her hands tied to her back. But when the gamer's soul moved into his body, he suddenly took pity on the maid, healed her wounds, and promised to be less of a scumbag. That morning, the chef, Zevis, served Weiss his breakfast, anticipating the dude to spit in his food as usual, but Weiss shocked him by complimenting the food's taste. Zevis was extremely honored and cried happy tears, rejoicing with the other domestic staff at Weiss's sudden change of heart. This new version of Weiss realized just how horrible his old version was, and decided from that day forth he would never bully anyone again and would discard his old personality. However, he planned to change in even more ways, knowing that the entrance exam for the academy he was to attend was only in 2 years. Having lost to Alan, the original protagonist in the video game, Weiss knew that his hype would eventually fizzle out and he'd be worthless. Even if it consumed all his strength, Weiss trained relentlessly and tried to keep up with his sadistic tutor, a spicy goth mama and S-rank adventurer named Avitas, who was practically the strongest swordsman in the royal capital. His vigorous training involved swordsmanship, practicing forms, improving his stamina and muscle training, which he complemented with protein-packed meals made from Zevis's flavored meatballs. After a while, Weiss got used to the physical training and his instructor's brutal nature. He was finally about to catch a break from swordsmanship training, but was disappointed to find that the twisted old hag would be his magic teacher. Thereafter, Weiss's training routine incorporated magic training and practical training with wooden swords. Even though Weiss was brutally wounded, he was proud of his efforts because a slob of fat like him had become a gym bro overnight. In his past life, he was a living corpse who buried his head in games night and day and easily surrendered, but he could work so diligently now. 2 months later, Avitas said she was impressed by Weiss's improvement, but he replied that his progress was all thanks to the support of his domestic staff, Lilith and Zevis, as well as Avitas herself, who had trained the life out of him. With this, he resolved in his heart to be an alpha version of his old self. The next day, Avitas took Weiss into the notorious League Belt town to conduct a practical test. On their way, some thugs noticed Lilith and wanted her for themselves, but this annoyed Weiss, and he swore to protect Lilith at all costs. Lilith herself was disgusted, but Avitas told her to ignore the fools because they weren't worth their time. For a minute, Weiss realized that Lilith radiated an incredible murder aura, but he dismissed it as just being his imagination. They arrived at the Adventurers Guild, and his opponents were determined to be some mega-monster giants known as the Buden Brothers, who were infamous for their evil deeds. Weiss wanted to chicken out, but Avitas told him he had to engage in real combat to ground himself to gain experience. She promised to be there for him, and if things got dangerous, she would certainly help him out, but that old witch scammed the life out of him and disappeared, leaving him with those punks. His first goal was to chop off one of their arms and to come up with a plan before they would drag him into an alley and beat him up. Meanwhile, Lilith and Avitas were chilling at a bar when those fools from earlier recognized Lilith as the pretty lady they had seen earlier. They introduced themselves as a band of thieves who wanted Lilith as one of their hostages. While this was happening, Weiss made the first move and chopped off the arms of one of the 3 brothers, following his instructor's advice to be the one to strike first. Right after chopping the first guy's arm, he kicked that one and chopped another person's arm in the process. Weiss successfully defeated all 3 guys, and the battle was won. He knew that if he had waited for them to take him into an alley, they would have surged with mana and increased their defenses further. Also, if all 3 of them had been combat-ready at the same time, Weiss would have had no chance of winning. Anyway, Avitas returned to the scene of the battle and said he had earned full points. But she said that if it were her, she would have chopped off someone's arm right from the Adventurers Guild, as that was the proactive approach. Lilith scored Weiss 200 points, while Avitas scored him 70 points. Later, he spotted bloodstains on Lilith's clothes and asked her what had happened, but she dismissed it swiftly, saying it was just his imagination. Somehow, that band of thieves who had oppressed her earlier and taken some hostages were all arrested, over 20 of them in number. The news of this conquest spread widely, and it was said that the bandits were beaten so badly they couldn't speak. Incidentally, it was reported that the notorious Boudin brothers were also arrested, all thanks to Weiss's effort. Listening to this news, a certain royal figure had her eyes on Weiss. Thereafter, a letter of appreciation and a cash prize were sent to Weiss's family. Thus far, it had been a year and 6 months since Weiss's training began, and intense training with Avitas was the order of the day. He survived running out of stamina and passing out from mana exhaustion to the point where such things no longer happened. Besides that, he had developed the ability to detect the enemy's presence even through the thickest walls and could feel mana flowing through his body. This was Weiss's measure of how much he had grown. One day, Zevis asked Weiss how his magic training was progressing, and Weiss said that it was going smoothly, although he had been having a hard time with Avita's Spartan training. She was forcing him to learn all 4 elements of magic, namely fire, water, wind, and earth, and to train them all equally. Obviously, Avita's was nothing short of a demon who was way worse than the Boudin brothers Weiss had just conquered. However, Zevis believed that the only reason Avita's was making Weiss do so much was that he possessed extraordinary talent. After all, originally, magic was supposed to be learnt at a rate of 1 element per person. Even Avita's herself could only use 2, but Weiss somehow possessed the rare talent to use all 4 elements. Zevis, thinking to himself, realized that if Weiss had remained lazy, his talent would never have blossomed. In the past, Weiss was quite careless, and so much so that it surprised Zevis, but no one expected him to keep working diligently without giving up until he attained such a level. It was for this reason that Zevis said that Weiss had become a truly admirable young man. Much later, Weiss was seen crying and screaming for justice for his life, as he pleaded with Avita's not to hit him again. Lilith got on her knees, pleading with the Iron Lady to stop wrecking Weiss's backside with her wooden sword already. The issue turned out to be that Weiss went behind Avita's back to practice magic. He apologized, and she asked him to demonstrate what he had learnt. To their utmost surprise, Weiss had learned how to use light and dark magic in addition to the 4 elements, but Avita's wondered why he kept it a secret from her. The guy explained that he was hoping to show it to her after fully learning it, but at its current stage, it was still incomplete. Avita's was surprised to hear this because, obviously, this was more than she could do, even for a pro. Anyway, Weiss further surprised her with the next move as he combined both light and dark magic, because that was his real and peculiar magical ability. In their very presence, he did combine it, showing them the result of his hard work for a year and a half. The scene switched, showing Weiss and Lilith in a ballroom during a dinner, in which Weiss had been yawning consistently. Lilith told him it was inappropriate to keep yawning in such a place, but she understood that it could be the fatigue from the magic he had displayed last night. That night, when he displayed his magic, it was demonstrated in its completed form. The light element's healing magic, known as the Healing Light, the dark element's curse poison, known as Dark Haze, and the magic combining both of them, known as Dark Heal, all automatically healed every ally within a certain range, while continuously dealing curse damage to the target recognized as an enemy. Although Weiss had successfully completed this technique, the mana consumption was insane, and he exhausted himself afterwards. This made him realize he still had to train more to increase his mana capacity. With Weiss's drowsy state, Lilith decided to wake him up by grabbing some of her piss. He noticed that her swift and agile movements mimicked those of an assassin, and suddenly wondered if she was one of those hidden guards said to be lurking in the Vincent family. But just then, one of the royals in attendance called him, and he was shocked to see Cynthia, the daughter of Countess Violetta, was standing right before him. Cynthia was beautiful with lustrous, shimmering hair and pretty red eyes, such that even a blind man could tell that she was a 10. It turned out that the lady was the game's main heroine, Cynthia Violetta. But right then, Cynthia had no better words to tell Weiss other than that he looked like he had just crushed a goblin and turned it into a muddy soup. This broke Weiss's heart, and he suddenly began to tremble, but soon remembered that he had been hated by every character in the game, and that his biggest hater was Cynthia. She was also the reason why his body ended up full of holes towards the end of the game, and he died serving as the Demon King's shield. As a member of the Vincent family, Weiss had reluctantly shown up at that event, but he should have known better than to participate in a gathering of such individuals. He never thought he would end up having an encounter with Cynthia before enrolling in the academy, but he still felt he should remain calm before the enrollment since he hadn't yet done anything to be hated by Cynthia. But just then, something flashed by his mind, which was a memory of the old Weiss. In that memory, he saw the old Weiss using his rod of discipline on Cynthia and threatening her with a sword. Coincidentally, Cynthia herself leaned into him, telling him she hadn't forgotten about what had happened back then, because he had used his title to forcefully invite her to his room and tried to taint her with his filthy hands. She called him a trash noble and asked him how he could be so brazen as to attend the party. Weiss knew it was all over for him because the old Weiss had messed things up for him and made Cynthia hate him so much that he felt he could die from her hate alone. But in that moment, Weiss bowed as low as he could, sincerely apologizing to Cynthia and accepting that it was all his fault and that he behaved in a manner that was disgusting and unexpected of a noble. Despite his sincere apology, Weiss wasn't expecting to be forgiven at all, but he knew that Cynthia's character wasn't so wicked as to trap someone who was genuinely apologetic. Just like he assumed, Cynthia was slightly moved by his apology, just said that she never thought he would lower his head in front of others, and it was obvious that even for a bit, Cynthia seemed to have calmed down. Weiss hoped that this action would lower the chances of his downfall, but for now, apologizing was all he could do, and he had to find the right moment to leave quickly. In reality, Weiss wished to get a little closer to Cynthia, whom he had a huge crush on in the original story, but he and Cynthia were like light and darkness and would never cross paths. He compared himself to a hero who got too close to the sun and said that if a noble such as himself, raised in disgrace, approached such a well-bred young lady, things wouldn't end well for him, and unfortunately he had no choice but to withdraw. But smack in the middle of his self-depreciating thoughts, Cynthia held his hands and asked him out on a dance with her. At the same time, Lilith appeared behind him, but both Weiss and Lilith were shocked. The next day, for some reason, Cynthia was having tea with Weiss at his place, which was so unexpected that Weiss began to recount the unfortunate series of events leading up to that point. Everything started the previous night when he was invited to a formal dance with Cynthia. She told him not to be so puzzled and explained that her willingness to dance with him stemmed from her noticing that he had become a better guy. Cynthia apparently knew about Weiss's daily training in preparation for entering the academy through some rumor among the nobles or something of that sort. She asked him why he seemed not to remember much about that day when he had attempted to hurt her, and Weiss acknowledged the truth, saying he didn't know how to apologize properly since he had no recollection of the memories leading up to that. As they danced even more, they got closer to each other's faces, and Cynthia reminded him that he had confessed his feelings for her. Weiss was shocked, but just then the dance had come to an end. Cynthia said she would see him again, but by then she had already stolen his heart and left him just like that. This, however, wasn't the end of everything. Later, Weiss's father, A.G. Vincent, sent him a letter saying that Cynthia would be attending a dinner party at their family house. In fact, she was already waiting outside in her carriage. Weiss already had a bad feeling about it. He was losing his cool and commanded his domestic staff to prepare everything to welcome the princess. However, there was another letter within the letter from Weiss's dad, which brings us to the present. Moments later, Weiss was enjoying the moment, having tea with Cynthia, whom he had a crush on, but he couldn't afford to get close to her because in the original story, Cynthia was supposed to end up with Alan. If Weiss got any closer to her, then the events with Alan wouldn't occur, and if the future got changed, then Weiss would be unable to act based on the scenario anymore. Even winning against Alan in the test could lead to a change in the future, but taking Cynthia away from Alan would completely ruin the entire scenario. And it would not only be bad if Weiss were disliked, but also if he were liked. This made him decide to maintain the perfect distance, but Cynthia wasn't about to make things easy for him. She reminded him of his confession that he had fallen in love with her at first sight, but also pointed out he had said it so arrogantly that she was dissatisfied. However, since he had sincerely apologized, she wasn't opposed to the idea. Weiss was glad that Cynthia had such a soft side, but he remembered that in the original story, she fell for the protagonist at a pretty fast speed. Cynthia was certainly soft-hearted, but this was a bad thing for Weiss because once the lady fell in love, she would become incredibly devoted. He planned to lower her affection for him somehow, but he was already too late because she had just mentioned that his quiet and shy side was cute. Just when Weiss was losing his mind, Lilith suddenly appeared with tea, almost startling him. He ended up letting out such a pathetic sound, so he felt that his disgusting under-the-sheets noises would have been enough to piss Cynthia off and destroy her feelings for him. However, the lady was already hopelessly in love with him, so there was nothing he could do. As Lilith was serving him tea, Cynthia reminded him that they had a matter to discuss, which his dad must have informed him about. This matter was pertaining to their engagement, and the dinner party they were both having was to serve as their introduction. Even though it was something both their parents had decided on all by themselves, Cynthia had also agreed to it after speaking to Weiss. All the while, Weiss's dad was busy with his goons, sharing how Weiss was such a troublesome son who was rather shy when it came to matters of love. Having seen that Weiss finally got a chance to dance with the famous Lady Cynthia, Weiss's dad had taken the initiative to swiftly settle the matter of their engagement without hesitation. The old fool was playing with sandcastles as he laughed all by himself, assuming his son would be over the moon with joy. One of his bodyguards asked him whether he had done the engagement thing with Weiss's approval, but Weiss's dad felt that, as his father, he could tell what the boy wanted by simply looking at his face. But this was the exact opposite of what was happening at the castle, because Weiss was already losing his mind, as Cynthia dropped the engagement bombshell and returned in her cart. The guy felt betrayed that his dad had sneakily organized the engagement with Cynthia, aside from that awkward tea party. Even though it was common for parents to decide the marriage partner in noble families, this wasn't some parent-arranged political marriage, but rather an arrangement made by Weiss's dad specifically to make his son happy. Weiss's dad hardly appeared in the original story or ever came home, so Weiss never knew what kind of father he was, but had now come to realize that his dad was the epitome of an excessively indulgent parent. While Weiss was so absorbed in his own misery, Lilith's expression was downcast, and she burst out crying, wishing him a happy life with Cynthia. Weiss was quite lost and trying to figure things out at the same time, but this lady took off with the speed of light, leaving him all by himself. Coincidentally, Avitas appeared and told him that his training quota for that day would be to chase Lilith, and she told him that Lilith was crying because the man she had been supporting for a year and a half had been suddenly taken away by a young lady who appeared out of the blue. Even though the engagement wasn't Weiss's decision, Avitas said she wouldn't allow him to ignore Lilith's sadness due to the engagement. As such, she punished him to return to the mansion with Lilith, or his punishment would be death. The boy didn't hesitate in darting right after Lilith, and while running, he realized that, truly, Lilith had always been by his side, and there was no way the lady wouldn't be shocked by his engagement to Cynthia. Not to mention that he owed Lilith a huge debt because if she hadn't supported him, he would have remained a lazy scoundrel. At every breath, Weiss thought he had almost gotten Lilith finally. She would disappear at an even faster speed, leaving him unable to catch her while she yelled at him to leave her alone. Dude was almost out of breath chasing Lilith, but the girl had lost it, crossing rivers with one skip and responding to him as he called her out to listen to him. Lilith told him everything was okay because the matter couldn't be helped, given that she was just a maid. While still chasing after her, Weiss told her that she wasn't just a maid but someone precious to him. He also let her know that the engagement was something his own father decided on his own, not something Weiss had decided. Also, he told Lilith that there was a servant system at the Noblesse Magic Academy where he would be enrolling. Only high-ranking nobles would be allowed to have one servant assigned as an exception, and he planned to take Lilith with him because he trusted her the most. Lilith remained calm for a minute and resumed running, asking him if that meant he was asking her out. The poor guy said that that was exactly why his lungs were already out of breath as he tried to chase her. Lilith wanted him to assure her that he would continue to chase after her forever, but by this point, Weiss knew that all he had left was his consciousness, and even that he was going to have to lose if he were to chase her forever. Either way, he told her that he certainly was going to keep chasing after her forever, and Lilith calmed down, saying that if he insisted, she would, from that day onwards, be his mistress. The poor lady didn't know that Weiss was already at his limit, and had started falling off a cliff when Lilith immediately sprang towards him and pushed him out of harm's way. Midair, with her arms wrapped around Weiss, she told him to put his mind at ease, and she would do her best not to let anyone ever know that they had become involved in such a relationship. Lilith believed that their love was a secret love, but just before Weiss could answer, they both splashed right into the spring water beneath them. And thus, Weiss was both engaged to Cynthia and having an affair with Lilith. All the while, the original game protagonist, Alan, was in some weird cave-like structure preparing for the entrance exam, which was close at hand. On our protagonist's end, Weiss was now living in the mess his father had created and couldn't wait to give the man a piece of his mind. Weiss, Lilith, and Cynthia were all on training grounds, getting some physical exercises from Avita's. She asked both ladies if either of them had sparred before, and they both answered that they had, although Lilith having any sparring experience seemed to shock Weiss. It turned out that both ladies had asked Avita's to train them as well in preparation for the entrance exam in a few months. Cynthia already had more than enough ability to pass with ease, and Lilith, whom Weiss was already going to have as his attendant, didn't have to take the test in the first place. But because Lilith wanted to support Weiss academically as well, he allowed her to take the test with him. Technically, neither of the ladies needed any training, and if Cynthia, who was guaranteed to pass in the first place, put in even more effort, she might become an even more formidable presence than in the original story. Speaking of Cynthia and Cynthia's prowess, Avita's took their training a notch higher and told Weiss to fight with Cynthia. Before the fight, Avita's warned Weiss not to hold back or be too captivated, simply because Cynthia was his fiancée. And then she told him not to wait for her to tell them to begin. Quite surprisingly, Cynthia was already midair attacking Weiss before he could even fully prepare. Although he managed to block her attack, Avita's reminded him about the lesson she had taught him about the most important thing in a fight being the very first move. Anyway, he was still on his knees when Cynthia disappeared yet again, and before he could know anything was happening to him, his feet were glued to the ground with ice, and he barely managed to move as she approached him from behind. The lady moved gracefully and swiftly across the ground thanks to her ice powers because she specialized in ice magic. Her signature move was to infuse her legs with magic, allowing her to move at high speed, almost as if she were skating, and then attack her opponent from their blind spots. However, Weiss soon got a clear advantage, and his wooden sword landed smack on her head. Cynthia burst out crying pettily, and Weiss apologized, saying he didn't mean to hurt her. He explained he had only meant to give her a light tap, but by then he had already caused a bump on her head. Avita's explained that it was because he swung his wooden sword at her while she was moving at high speed, which turned his harmless attack into a strong counterattack. Cynthia herself was still tearful and admitted she was frustrated because she had sparred several times before, but her fight with Weiss was the very first time any of her attacks had been dodged so easily. She was still sulking, so Lilith used healing magic to fix her bumpy head, and Cynthia thanked her, returning to her cheerful state right away. Avita's was quite surprised, though, that Weiss read Cynthia's high-speed movement, so she asked him how he did it. He gave no reasonable answer, so it seemed pure luck, and she said they would test if that was just a fluke or not by putting him in a fight against Lilith. West felt it was unfair that he was fighting again, but his tutor told him to stop whining like a cranky, sausage-starved granny and get on with it. As they were both in position to begin the fight, Weiss felt there was no way he could spar with Lilith because the lady was just a maid. But again, he had seen Lilith's moves time and again, and her speed was anything but belonging to a mere maid. He knew that if he let his guard down, he would certainly die, but soon enough, his suspicions came true as Lilith was moving around that field at crack speed, appearing and disappearing before he could land a significant hit. Somehow, Weiss trained his eyes to notice her movements and managed to block her attacks. It then became clear to Avita's that Weiss could see Lilith's movement, and that meant that Weiss seeing through Lady Cynthia's high-speed movement wasn't just a fluke. On the other hand, Weiss was surprised because in the original story, Lilith was just Weiss's attendant who barely had any screen time, but here she was being so unimaginably strong. The lady had only started learning magic, but her speed was far superior to Weiss's, and she was also a skilled swordsman. Weiss knew that if he didn't take his fights seriously, he would certainly lose, so he activated his power known as Dark Heal. which was a balance of light and dark magic. This instantly Lilith recognized, because she was forced into a circle as the skill healed allies within the magic circle while continuously dealing curse damage to Weiss's enemies. She knew she had to get out of that circle quickly, and noticed that since Weiss had temporarily let go of his wooden sword to cast that magic with both hands, he was completely defenseless. However, Lilith also considered that even if she escaped the circle, she was someone who could only fight in close combat, and Weiss would just end up attacking her with magic from the inside, leaving her unable to defend herself. She seized the only chance she saw and used the opening that was right in front of her, but Weiss stood there with a smile on his face and activated a magical barrier that sent her bouncing right off. That magical barrier was his absolute barrier, thanks to his original magic, which combined the permanence of dark magic with the protection of light magic. It also helped that he had recently been using magic known as Dark Eye, that helped him in such a way that even if his body couldn't keep up with Lilith's speed, by making full use of his Dark Eye and absolute barrier magical abilities, he could keep defending against her attacks as long as his mana held out. Avitas asked Lilith if she was about to give up that easily, but the two Tartars soon noticed something was weird and told Weiss to quickly cancel his magic. Before they knew anything, Lilith was dizzy and had already passed out flat on the ground. When she was revived, she admitted being utterly defeated by Weiss, but the poor guy was worried about her health. Avitas reassured him that she had given Lilith an advanced potion that would recover her, but she also asked Weiss what magic it was that he used. She knew that the magic sapped away vigor, but never imagined that Lilith of all people would go down in just a few seconds, so she wanted to know if there were other effects to the magic. It was then that Weiss said that his magic, the Dark Heal, had a variety of effects, such as physical weakening, mana drain, movement speed decrease, and literally everything that would shut down his opponents. And because Lilith had relatively little mana reserve, her mana was drained so quickly that it led to her collapse. But Weiss was the exact opposite, who could add all the stats he stole from his enemy and make himself more powerful. The more enemies there were within the magic circle, the stronger he would become, and if he recognized someone as an ally, he could grant them the same enhancements. As the lady listened to this whiz kid ramble on, they were all shocked. He wondered if it was the right time to say all he really wanted to say. In his mind, he knew there was an ultimate line everyone dreamt of saying after reincarnating into another world, and he had always wanted to say it. But just as he began uttering his useless words, Avitas challenged him to a duel, saying she was glad he had grown so significantly, and it had been so long since she felt so fired up. In fact, she wanted him to use his powers to calm her down, but obviously, Weiss had not gotten to the level where he wouldn't be buried almost alive in his training with Avitas. Anyway, from that day onwards, Lilith and Cynthia joined the training, enduring Avitas every day, but the misunderstanding between him and the lady was unresolved and unattended soon. Before they knew it, the days and months flew by, and finally, it was the day of the entrance test into the Nobalese Magic Academy. That very morning, some much bigger guy at the Academy's entrance test was bullying Alan and raised his fist to attack him, but Weiss stepped in before he could land his attack on Alan and glared at him while squeezing his useless fists. But while he was saving Alan, the whole school began gossiping about Weiss, calling him the infamous noble thug and spreading rumors of his engagement to Cynthia. Anyway, when the big guy recognized that he was with the villainous noble, he immediately apologized, and Weiss told him to get lost. As the guy dashed off, Weiss couldn't believe that even though he had been reincarnated for a long time, his bad reputation was still persisting strongly. He planned to be as friendly as possible and change people's narrative about him gradually. But for now, his present focus was to defeat a certain opponent who was none other than Alan. Speaking of Alan, he came up from behind Weiss and extended a hand while introducing himself and telling him that they should both do their best. Weiss extended his hand also, but just before they could shake each other, the warning bell was rung and they both had to hurry to the battleground. A lady named Cheryl, who was Alan's childhood friend, turned back to Weiss, thanking him for helping Alan. But on their way, Weiss couldn't believe the sudden, weird feeling he had when he realized that he had hesitated to reach for Alan's hand. Even talking to Alan filled him with an unbearable sense of unease. but it was not that he didn't like Alan particularly. Because even after hopefully defeating him in the exam, Weiss planned to stay on friendly terms with the guy while keeping a healthy distance. In the exam hall, their instructor, after having them write the written test, told them it was time for the practical combat test and asked them to change into some uniforms that would help reduce damage from both magic and combat. Weiss was dealing with a restless heart and couldn't suppress the throbbing unease he felt, because something was surging through his veins, urging him to crush not just Alan but every single person in the room. While Weiss was dumbfounded at this sudden bloodlust and wondered what was wrong with him, the examiner announced that the terms of declaring a winner was whoever knocked their opponent out of the ring or made them surrender. He asked if anyone had questions, and then some poor guys shared that their uniforms were too small for them. But this frustrated the examiner, who wondered what sort of cheap steroids these dudes were on. Anyway, one of the guys who was about to contest was Duke, Alan's close friend, Duke, whom he cheered on to win. Lilith felt it was so cute that their school created uniforms for them, all of them, but Cynthia told her not to think much of it because it was common for a bunch of students to ditch their uniforms and disappear. That showed just how hellish life was after entering the academy. Noblesse Academy was the most prestigious, yet the most brutal educational institution in their kingdom, and anyone who couldn't keep up was expelled on the spot. The lessons were so intense that some of the students never made it out alive, and many would discard their uniforms as soon as they left, never wanting to see them again. That being said, getting into the academy wasn't actually that hard because even the old, lazy version of Weiss managed to pass in the original story. Anyway, the next battle was between Weiss and Alan, so the teacher announced their fight, and it was time for them to face off. By then it was already raining heavily, and one of the guys even tried to let the teacher know that these guys couldn't fight in the rain. But the examiner said everyone except those who were about to fight should move to their spectator seats. When everyone was protected from the rain, Alan admitted that he never thought he would fail. He also admitted that he never thought he would face Weiss in a mock battle, and so they should make their fight a good one. However, Weiss said literally nothing. It was time for the mock battle to begin, but almost immediately Weiss swung into action before Alan could prepare for battle. He then almost immediately activated his dark heal magic on the poor guy, draining not only his mana, but that of the examiner who was conducting their fight. Already, Weiss couldn't help himself because there was an overwhelming feeling and a burning urge to crush Alan. At the same time, his magic was no longer draining the instructor, but rather restoring the person's vigor. Weiss tried understanding what he was feeling inside, and suspected that it was the old version of Weiss's self who was baring his fangs outward. In the end, the entrance exams were over, and Avidas and Zevis were hosted by the headmaster, Gills, who was surprised that Weiss broke all the previous records in every single exam. He asked Avidas what she had done to the boy to give him such dangerous abilities. But just then, some guy, who was also at the dinner, reminded the headmaster that Weiss didn't technically break any records, even though his scores were the highest in academic history, because there was an incoming student the previous year with whom he tied for first place. Anyway, Avidas said she hadn't done anything special for Weiss, and at the most, had only provided the guy some basic training, while Zevis said he only supported Weiss with meals, but with stupendous amounts of proteins consisting of soy, dairy, and chicken tenders. However, the staff member got angry that Zevis was messing with them, because there was no way that muscle brain could have achieved peak scores with just protein. Avidas picked up her mug and started drinking what was inside, saying she had no words to tell them because they wouldn't believe her. They briefly switched to condemning Avidas for her unruly conduct, particularly that she was drinking right in front of the headmaster. But the teacher was even more enraged at the headmaster because Weiss had nearly taken Alan's life and the poor boy nearly died. Alan was apparently a student whom that teacher had personally trained and had exceptional talent, but it was obvious he was only being so jealous of Avidas, and so Avidas told him to quit being a hater. They engaged in a verbal back and forth, and then Zevis told them both to shut the heck up. He then told the headmaster that even though he was concerned about Weiss's enrollment, they should rest assured that Weiss would never use his power against the weak because he had changed. Rather than being consumed by his own abilities, Weiss pushed himself with genuine effort to become a real man who was strong and courageous. Anyway, Weiss, Cynthia, and Lilith all received their admission letters, and in their first class, their teacher welcomed them all, introducing herself as Chloe, who would be in charge of their class. A lot of students made it in, including Alan, whom Weiss had defeated successfully. Back then, Weiss was consumed by his old version, the emotions of his old and worthless version, as this led him to almost beat Alan to death. But no matter how many times he knocked the boy down, Alan kept getting back up and getting stronger each time. In the end, though, Weiss won by a landslide, although it had taken far longer to bring Alan down than he had expected. This sort of irritated him, because he felt he was being shown by Alan firsthand what it meant to be a true protagonist. Anyway, during the lectures, the back of everyone's hand started glowing, and Chloe explained that each one of them had been granted 1,000 points, which was a measure that would follow them all the way to graduation. Right now, everyone had 1,000 points, but Weiss, based on his test result, had been granted 2,000 points. The whole class was in uproar and asked what the heck that school meant, because if their points were a serious measure, then doubling Weiss's points was a bit too harsh on everyone else. They asked for Chloe to explain the points properly, and so she said that rather than her wasting her time to explain everything with words, it would be easier for the students to understand through experience. Instantly, she told them to grab a wooden sword each and head to the training grounds. When they were out there, Chloe stated that even though she had congratulated them all on their enrollment, she never told them she would see them through to graduation. And that meant simply that any student whose points were narrowed to 0 would be expelled on the spot. And so, her goal for that day was to have the students fight until someone's points hit 0. At the same time, Avitas felt her days were getting emptier since Weiss left for the academy, and so she decided to keep herself busy by getting a teaching license at the Magic Academy. The next day, a guy introduced himself as Louis and confessed that he felt Weiss was amazing during the mock battle. However, the bombastic side-eyes from both Lilith and Cynthia were enough to make him give up on that conversation. Louis was a bright, refreshing, good-looking character who, in the original story, achieved excellent grades and graduated at the top of his class. However, that very Louis was in this Weiss's current world such a loser whose points had been drained to 0 and had been expelled. Actually, the guy had been utterly crushed by Alan a few moments ago. But this was something that haunted Weiss even during lunch break. He was trying his best not to destroy the scenario and avoid unnecessary actions aside from beating Alan, so the original story would remain intact as much as possible. But right now, things had changed. The main heroine of the story was Weiss's fiancée and not Alan's, as it was in the game. And then, Louis, who was supposed to stay until graduation, ended up leaving on the very first day in real life. Everything was spiraling into unforeseen chaos, and even more unexpected were the dark emotions almost consuming Weiss, which were emanating from his past self. Ever since he met Alan, Weiss's old self had been ordering him to get aggressive not only towards Alan, but to everyone else around him. So now, Weiss's emotions had changed from playing the nice guy and gaining people's trust to having a strong, overwhelming desire to crush them all. He knew that if he gave in to those negative emotions and hurt the people around him, he would end up a hated character just like in the original story. Almost as if she was listening to his thoughts, Cynthia said that if Weiss really wanted to crush everyone, it was fine by her. Weiss was shocked, wondering how Cynthia wasn't madly upset at him for saying such a wicked thing. But she reminded him that he was in the Noblesse Magic Academy, and in the beginning, he had made her worry so much because of how extremely kind he was. In a world where it was to crush or be crushed, Weiss couldn't afford to show mercy to his opponent. Anyway, after seeing how Weiss fought during the test, Cynthia had started seeing him in a new light. Lilith admitted to feeling the same way, stating that the world of competition was a harsh one, and if they chose to stand in it, then they had to be as ruthless as that world. But in the end, doing what he wanted was what was most important, and Lilith promised she'd support him no matter what. Interrupting their conversation, some chef looking like someone's Halloween costume inspo asked if they wanted more food, but again, Cynthia said she had had enough. She turned her attention to Weiss, saying that since he was her fiancé, he had to possess the spirit to knock everyone else down. Feeling accepted and understood, Weiss thanked Cynthia and Lilith. Seeing he was glad he could talk to them, even though he wasn't sure he could come to terms with things right away, Lilith suggested that since he couldn't decide what to do, they could toss a coin instead. Weiss agreed to this because his scenario was already half in ruins and nobody would know what was going to happen from there on out. So he would stop thinking altogether and let the coin decide everything. Right as he tossed that coin, the chef that had been begging everyone to eat his sad experiment attacked Weiss, saying he put in a lot of effort into making his food and he would want him to eat all of it. At that time, Weiss's coin tossed right out of his hands and bounced away while he eagerly anticipated what side would turn up. On the front of the coin was a depiction of the kingdom's castle, and on the back of the coin was a dragon symbolizing the strongest. If the coin showed heads, then Weiss would fight against the impulse to avoid ruin and make an effort to get along with Alan. But if tails came up, that was left for fate to decide. He hadn't completely decided on that when Alan picked the coin off the floor, handing it over to Weiss. He said he was glad that he got enrolled even after being beaten to a pulp by Weiss, because, matter-of-factly, he wanted to fight Weiss again. When he placed the coin in Weiss's hand, it was tails up, showing the dragon and determining that Weiss was going to have to give in to his murderous desires to beat the life out of everyone, especially Alan. Moments later, on the training ground, Weiss had a practice fight with one of his classmates, but he defeated the student without using too much energy, leading to their expulsion. His next opponent was one of those big guys, the one named Gustav, and Weiss beat him up until he was expelled. This went on and on with a couple more students, numbering about 6 in total, but Cynthia and Lilith were massively impressed that Weiss had gotten rid of 6 more rivals in a single day. They were working in cahoots, and Weiss was giving the ladies directions on how to arrange themselves to draw the attention of the enemies. He owed this side of him to Alan because, thanks to the guy, Weiss was no longer going to hesitate and planned to crush him head-on. All the while, there was one female student who was already at a miserable 22 points, and low-key counting down to her imminent expulsion. At the end of that day's match, Weiss's team was declared the winner, and he had defeated Alan yet again. It had been a month since enrollment, and 10 students had dropped out of their school. Out of those, 7 of those students were sent packing by Weiss himself, and it was no surprise because Weiss ranked first in virtually every field, ranging from magic stealth training to magic tracking training and magic defense training. He had become unstoppable, and literally no one could stand in the way of him and his goal. Alan's buddy, Duke, cursed Weiss and asked whether he was in his second life, or what sort of demonic training regimen he had to follow to become so strong. Duke was a childhood friend to Cheryl and Alan, who had witnessed a battle between Weiss and Alan, where Weiss slipped right past Cheryl's magic threads and flattened Alan in an instant, snatching the flag before anyone could blink. This rose Weiss's points to 5,700, placing him first by what was beyond a landslide. Cheryl told Duke to shut up with his excessive yapping, while Alan apologized to his friends for losing to Weiss again. Cheryl told him not to worry about it, but to ensure to win next time instead, and the lady gave Weiss the nastiest glare ever. Weiss wasn't upset because the old version of Weiss would vent his negative emotions in nasty and underhanded ways, which was why he ended up hated by those around him. But the current version of Weiss was letting those emotions out fair and square through matches. He hadn't done anything to feel guilty about, and there was no reason for anyone to hate him. So all he wanted was for Cheryl to stop staring at him so menacingly. In class, the teacher addressed the student with 22 points, the lady named Carta, telling her that in the next practical test, if she didn't score any points, she would be expelled from the school. The lady was out of it already, preparing for her inevitable defeat, but Weiss, who was seated some rows behind her, kept staring at her. He remembered her as a character in the original story who was expelled after the next exam. Using that frustration as fuel, she motivated her best friend to get serious and aim for graduation, and that was how their side story went. Even though it was a fair match, Alan ended up getting Carta's best friend expelled. So basically after this, the lady was likely to quietly leave the place without leaving a mark. Some mean lady later walked up to Carta, asking her what her plan was for the next exam, because it was a tag battle and they knew she didn't have a partner. They mocked her, saying her annoying bestie got expelled, and mocked the lady for losing all her points in a single match. While they were saying nasty things, Weiss appeared, shocking them both and shutting them up. He walked up to Carta and asked her if she would like to team up with him for the next exam, and she agreed. Later, on an open field, Carta asked Weiss why he would want to pair up with such a loser like her who was on the verge of expulsion while he was the top-ranked first-year student. Not to mention that Weiss already had Cynthia in his corner. Just when Carta mentioned Cynthia, she noticed the silhouette of a lady belonging to none other than Cynthia herself, who had at this point transformed into a very scary-looking demon. Weiss noticed Carta's look of terror and told her not to be concerned about Cynthia because his fiancée only wanted him to be the best in the academy, and the lady understood that Weiss's partnering with another lady was just a means for him to win. Carta tried explaining that she had sensed more than he was explaining, as Cynthia's bloodlust was very palpable, but Weiss told her to listen, saying it's not like he was trying to help her because he didn't even have the time to feel sorry for every weak student who got expelled. But it would be a real waste if Carta actually got expelled because she had impressive magical flying ability. Her flying magic was one that even skilled mages found difficult to handle, so Weiss felt it would be such a tragedy for someone as skilled as Carta, who could control her flying magic, to go unnoticed. While he was talking, this silly lady kept searching for Cynthia, because she was pretty sure she had seen a demonic version of Cynthia appear and disappear in a few minutes. Anyway, Weiss went on yapping, and Cynthia eventually found Carta, telling the lady that she had an impressive sensing ability, because she was able to pick up on faint traces of magic that even Weiss couldn't detect. In fact, Cynthia wondered whether Carta's perception was even sharper than Weiss's dark eye skill. However, Carta still had failed to notice Lilith, who had mastered assassination techniques. Lilith said that the upcoming tag battle was apparently a joint exam for all 3 school years, and it seemed Weiss had found some kind of winning strategy in partnering with someone with a special ability like Carta instead of with Lilith or Cynthia, who could effectively fight on their own, even against second- and third-year students. Cynthia urged Carta that she would be pairing with Lilith, so Carta should feel free to take on the exam with Weiss. Somehow, when Weiss finished his solo rants, Carta appeared right behind him and agreed to pair up with him, leading to the preparation of the upcoming exams. That very day, practice commenced, and Weiss realized that flying magic was pretty tricky to master, and he felt he was finally getting the hang of it. However, Carta reminded him that he couldn't even stay in the air for 2 seconds, just like his wand. So the plan for their exams would be that she will be flying with him, riding with her, and there was no actual need for Weiss to learn it anyway. Weiss accepted that he couldn't learn it that moment, although he had figured it would be the chance to learn it. But Carta told him that there was no harm in knowing flying magic, because any magic could become a powerful weapon depending on how it was used. Plus, she could teach him a bit even though it had really nothing to do with the exam. In exchange for her teaching him, West said he would absolutely ensure that she didn't get expelled, only if she would agree to train him in flying magic now and after the exams. Carta smiled, as she had only ever heard that Weiss was a lazy person and only got to find out that very day that he was such a hard worker, and so she agreed to help him. She wanted to be like Weiss, who was always eager to learn and explore new things. Meanwhile, Chloe was with the head teacher, and the old man Gills couldn't believe how impressive Weiss's scores were, especially for an underclassman. On top of that, more than half of the expelled students were taken down by Weiss alone, showing that he was certainly impressive. Chloe said that Weiss definitely was, but the rest of their first years were equally exceptional. And the one who surprised her the most was the other teacher's apprentice, Alan. Alan possessed so much resilience that he kept rising back up from the brink of failure countless times, only to wax stronger each time. The other 2 who caught Chloe off guard were Lilith and Cynthia, who had grown exponentially from the first time they came. Both ladies were training as if their lives were on the line without wearing reinforced training gear. They were also engaging in dangerous combat with real swords instead of wooden ones, and their risky life-or-death training had made them incredibly stronger. Following their practice, both ladies would then bestow healing magic upon each other, bloodied up but still determined to get stronger. Cynthia said she was going to get stronger so that she wouldn't just be someone tagging along with Weiss, but would keep standing by his side as an equal. Lilith similarly admitted that she wanted to do the same for Weiss so that, when he was in danger, she would be someone he could rely on. But for now, both ladies accepted that their immediate and pressing goal was to drag Carter away from Weiss's side. Anyway, the day of the exam finally arrived, and Duke played a game of rock, paper, scissors with Cheryl and Alan, with the condition that whoever lost would have to pair up with some random stranger. While that was happening, Carter and Weiss arrived and were instantly transported to Mount Gariel. They revised the plan, which was that they would go after the upperclassmen with the highest points and take them down. So they were only waiting for the instructor to kickstart the event. Soon the countdown began and they were instructed to begin right away. Meanwhile, Avitas was busy living the life, using simps as her footstool while not actively trying to get that teacher's license in the academy. The competition started, and the first scapegoats were some poor first-years who had been electrocuted and inevitably disqualified. They had been targeted by some foolish seniors who were quite pleased that first-years were such easy targets. One of the two knew it would be better for them not to underestimate the juniors because they were underclassmen, because in that very same class was an amazing student. The other guy huffed, saying all the famous students just like that one had already gotten expelled from their own class. Meaning they were all talk. Just as they brought up Weiss's name and started talking about him, he quickly eliminated one of them, and the other moved to protect himself with his barriers and basic fire spells. That second-year student turned out to be a little more competent than his fallen comrade, because his seemingly basic fire spell was packed with high-density magical power, and he cast it without incantation. The star on that guy's shoulder was one awarded for achieving excellent grades, meaning he was the real deal, and of course, there was no need to hold back. For that reason, Weiss activated a spell known as the Unnatural Wall, which permitted him to slide down from a distance high up in the air. At the same time, the second-year student cast a fire spell to burn him to ashes, but instead of Weiss, the spell hit a poor tree nearby and set it ablaze. The second-year student was surprised to see Weiss change direction midair, but Weiss did the same thing again, and before the guy could steady himself for the attack that was coming his way, he had received 3 face-resetting punches all at once and also in his guts. This was all possible thanks to a new skill Weiss had acquired in the process of learning flying magic. He unfortunately was unable to master that to its fullest potential, so he picked up a new skill instead. The Unnatural Wall, as he called it, which was a transparent wall formed by combining dark magic, light magic, and non-elemental magic. It could disappear and appear midair for Weiss, who used it as a foothold. That being said, the Unnatural Wall lasted only a split second, and the farther away he was from the ground, the more mana it drained, meaning he couldn't go very high. Still, this had improved his tactical options, and it was apparent that learning flying magic wasn't a total waste, despite his failure to master the skill itself. In the middle of his solo reflection, someone found a perfect opportunity to attack Weiss, but thanks to his barrier, the blow was softened. Before Weiss's eyes, this dude was blown to smithereens, thanks to an attack launched by Carta, who was flying high in the air. She explained that she'd been trying to let him know that another team was about to attack them, and in the absence of Weiss's response, she had to take the initiative to attack. Weiss said she made the right call, but their conversation was interrupted by another student who had seemingly studied Weiss's magic. The guy said he noted Weiss's magic was a combination of light and dark magic, but all his abilities, even though they were high-spec, were largely inefficient because he couldn't use them repeatedly. This yapper was the partner of the dude Carta had just defeated, but he told them not to get too carried away because the chances of Weiss and Carla defeating him were slim to none. Immediately after, he took off his glasses and flung them, saying combat ability was 3 times the normal whenever he took off his glasses. However, Weiss immediately activated the Dark Heal and instantly began to drain his opponent's power. But this turned out to be a surprise to Mr. Four Eyes, Zero Brains, because it wasn't part of the data he gathered, and he had no knowledge of this aspect of Weiss's magic. Anyway, Weiss blasted him and told him to return after doing more research. Thereafter, that student was eliminated, and Weiss urged Carta to continue in grabbing points from the careless upperclassmen. Weiss had accumulated 7,000 points, while Carta had gone from 22 to a whopping 1,300 points. Meanwhile, Cynthia and Lilith had finally come face to face with Alan and Cheryl and were braced to have the hottest showdown. On the other hand, Weiss went on to defeat more opponents and kick them out of the competition, up until a point where the second and third year students had completely stopped showing up. Carta said that it seemed those students were not around anymore, but Weiss said maybe it was all because the magic birds were announcing how frequently the second and third years were getting knocked over, leading to them becoming more conscious. Even if they were aware that there was now a strong opponent and had gotten cautious about him, Weiss was intent on hunting for the second and third years, forgetting all about their own classmates in the first year. Carta agreed to do this with him, with a look of determination in her eyes. The reason why he had teamed up with her was because of her special flying magic, which was even difficult for veteran mages to control, and Carta's extraordinary detection ability. She quickly spotted a third year who had been quite excellent at hiding their magic, and Weiss headed off sporadically in that direction. With flying magic and detection, they could scout wide areas and launch surprise attacks from above. In a forest, it would be difficult to guard against attacks from directly overhead, and with those flying birds all up in the air, it would be even harder for them to recognize Weiss as a human. Anyway, he landed a surprise attack on the unsuspecting third year. He was able to do this because such people who were unaware rarely used magic to protect themselves, so a strike from a blind spot could always get rid of them in one shot. And this was why Avitas had always been nagging about taking the first move. So far, Weiss and Carta had about 20 minutes, so he was impatient and said they should hurry and find the third-year students quickly. Carta said they had already earned enough points, and there was no need to take any more risks. But Weiss said it was nowhere near enough because the point system came with special privileges, and their rewards would only be greater with the number of points. The privileges were that anyone with 20,000 points was at S rank and could skip grades and graduate early. 15,000 points would grant one an A rank, giving them a full tuition waiver. 10,000 points could give one a B rank and a luxurious private room. 5,000 points or more would get one a private room and place them at C rank. But anyone with 4,999 points or less would end up in a shared room. And currently, Weiss was at C rank, where he could get only a private room. By the time the freshers moved up to the second and third grades, the number of students would drop significantly, and the number of A and B rank students would increase. But in this academy's long history, not a single student had ever reached S rank. So it was clear that Weiss was aiming for the S rank, and was doing so by hunting down the upperclassmen. But he said, quite contrary to what Carta understood, that his immediate plan was to attain B rank because what was most important to him at that time was to have the private room privileges of a B rank. That private room came with endless choices of premium fruits, and that was all he was after. This was because about a year ago, Weiss had only derived pleasure in his dessert after meals, especially after intense training. But as the training crew grew harsher, he gradually lost his sense of taste for fruit. But one day, Zevis prepared something special for him, which was the super premium fruit Milo Melon. That day, Weiss regained the sense of taste he had lost, and so he was yearning for Milo Melon, although it was hard to obtain. However, it was present in the B-rank room service, and that was why he was willing to rake in as many as he could from the upperclassmen and needed Carta's cooperation until the very end. The lady quickly agreed to help him since he was helping her too, although she couldn't believe that Weiss's unusual motivation for the exam was all because of food. Actually, Carta realized that her family grew the Milo melons, so she wondered if he would visit and have some of her Milo melons if she were to tell him about it. Just then, up ahead, they could both see and feel an enormous amount of mana radiating. Carta was saying they had to get out of there immediately, but before she could complete her statement, Weiss had already jumped off the boom and headed in the direction of the danger that he should be running from because he was quite excited. She asked him why he was charging straight at them head-on, but he was too obsessed with the adventure to listen to her. Finally, his search led him to a lady sitting quietly in a chair, a second-year student named Eva. He introduced himself, saying it was an honor to finally meet her and have a match with her. Apparently, Eva was the strongest student in the academy, who was also known as the true last boss, an official cheat, and a game-breaking bug, unlike anything seen in game history. Because of her overwhelming strength, she grew bored of academy life, and according to the game's original story, she would leave the academy of her own accord right after the tag exam. In the game, Eva was the strongest character that no one had ever defeated, but Weiss knew that if he had to fight her any time at all, he had to win now. With only 10 minutes left, he would give it all he had and bring the exam arc to a close. Going all out, he launched the first attack on Eva. Meanwhile, Cheryl had been defeated by Lilith and Cynthia, and it was only Alan left for them to fight. Now that it was just him, the lady said that if they could manage to defeat Alan, maybe Weiss would finally acknowledge them, and so he should prepare himself. But right before their eyes, something awakened in Alan, almost something that could be called a monstrosity. Minutes later, the exam had come to an end, and the battleground on which Weiss and Eva stood was all up in flames. Unfortunately, the exam had come to an end before Weiss could even land a scratch on Eva. But she said the fight with him wasn't so bad, even though he had forced her to use magic. The fight with Eva made him realize that she was so strong because none of his attacks on her worked. Not the dark heel, the dark eye, or the absolute barrier, and she had managed to come out without a single scratch. In any case, Eva acknowledged that she was initially going to transfer and quit the academy right after the current exam. But since she had now taken a special liking to Weiss, she would hang around the academy for a longer time. With that, the exam had been concluded and all students were sent back to the Magic Academy. But this also meant that, once again, Weiss had made a major change to the scenario, given that Eva had changed her mind and decided to stay at the academy, while Carta had avoided getting expelled from the school by significantly raising her points. However, quite oddly, Lilith and Cynthia had been defeated. Weiss was surprised and wondered who might have done this. So both ladies started apologizing to each other first, saying they were blaming themselves for assuming they had gotten strong enough but had failed to see their flaws because they were blinded by their insistence on defeating Alan. The moment Alan's name was mentioned, Weiss's eyes turned and lingered on him with an intensity that even Alan himself could feel. However, Weiss stared with a look of strong, unwavering determination. And with that, the joint 3-year tag exam had come to an end. The students all returned to their usual academy life, and Weiss was promoted to B rank, gaining the life of luxury he so yearned for. However, every day was still constantly competitive, although it was starting to be boring and dissatisfying for Weiss to compete against the lower-ranked students in his class. For a while, it seemed like his peaceful days would continue, up until one day when a guest instructor was introduced to the class. With Alan defeating ladies as powerful as Lilith and Cynthia, who will emerge stronger between him and Weiss? If you'd like to find out in Part 2, guess the name of the Academy's new instructor and put their name in the comment section. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for similar content. As always, thanks for watching.